We are going to talk about the Atlantic slave trade and the cause and effects of the institution. The economic trade institution began with the Portuguese in the late 15th century, taking control of the already existing African slave trade. Approximately 10 million Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas and the Caribbean in order to work on plantations. Although it was abolished in 1807, it would leave long-lasting impacts on the places that had participated in the trade.
So where did the slaves come from? Well, the slaves came from Africa since they already had slavery. African leaders conquered other kingdoms and they saw the people they conquered as criminals or prisoners of war. People who were in debt to the African leaders would be forced to serfdom or were enslaved. The slaves were traded to the Europeans who would then ship their slaves to different places such as the Caribbean. The Caribbean slave owners would also sell the slaves to the colonies. The colonial slave owners in the South would threaten their rebellious slaves of sending them to the Caribbean, which would occur sometimes if the slaves failed to escape their master.
Why the need for the slave trade? Well, during the age of exploration, the Portuguese had found the sophisticated trading systems of the African kingdoms of Mali and Ghana and wanted to trade with them. However, during the 16th century, they began trading for slaves. Also, the expanding European colonies needed a labor force to work their plantations. The South British colonies needed a labor force because the indentured servants proved to be rebellious and didn't want to work. The Europeans in the Caribbean and South America also needed a labor force to work their plantations in order to get the raw materials. They did not have indentured servants, but tried having Indian slaves. The native Indians that were in the Americas would die from the diseases that the European settlers had brought when they came from the European nations. With low survival rates for Indian workers, another labor force had to be found from somewhere. They obtained it through the Africans, who did not die easily in the colonies because they had built an immunity from diseases in Africa and they were accustomed to working in tropical climates. The African leaders also participated in the trade because they were getting rich from it. The Europeans would exchange guns and other manufactured goods for slaves, gold, and ivory. The Africans would use the guns to take over other kingdoms or tribes in order to expand their dominion and boost their economy.
Here we have the Middle Passage in which slaves were transported from Africa to the West. They were chained and branded and packed into wooden shelves. Ships were usually overcrowded up to the point that the Africans couldn't move, as seen in these pictures. Also, there was no cleaning done on the lower deck and it led to unsanitary conditions which caused diseases. Then in contribution to this, with the shortage of supplies, the sick who needed food would die. The dead would be thrown into the sea, as seen in the first image. In addition, the women and children were abused by the crew of the ship. And there were Africans who have even committed suicide thinking that they were safe in that way and that it involved less suffering than what awaited them.
Here we have a map of the Atlantic slave trade where it gives us all the information regarding the Atlantic slave trade exportations. We see who was involved in the trade, such as the European nations and also the Arabians who carried out their trade in Africa and also to the Middle East. From the west coast, we can see that the African slave trade went to the New World and also to Liverpool and Bristol, who gained masses of wealth from the slave trade, and the long distances from Africa to the New World. We can't even imagine how terrible the trip must have been for the African slaves. The Stone of Rebellion that occurred in the South instilled fear among the white elites who now believe that slaves are dangerous, so they must be controlled. Southern society went through a shift in voting. It was previously based on class, with only elites and the yeomanry being able to vote and not the indentured servants, poor whites, which you can see in the diagram below. However, with the Atlantic slave trade, the class system changed, and where voting was now based on race. Black people did not vote, while whites, no matter their class, could vote. Northerners, such as the Quakers during the American Revolution, began to fight for anti-slavery in the colonies because they felt it was hypocritical of them to fight for freedom without giving that same freedom to the black slaves. They also did not rely on slave labor since their economy was based on small-scale industry. However, African slavery had become the major economic labor force in the South. Southern elites had also used slaves in order to promote how wealthy they were and their position in society. This was based on the view of hegemonic liberty, how much dominion you had over others. Slaves were their property, and they had the right to use them as they pleased.
The effects on Africa. The Atlantic slave trade had an effect on their economy, for their populations were decreasing with their exportation to other countries. The strongest of the African men were shipped out, which meant that there was little workforce to do their labor in their country. Their nation wasn't able to develop economically, and the Europeans supplied them with guns, rum, and things that wouldn't last or weren't as useful. The Europeans at first began kidnapping slaves on a small scale, but found it better to establish a trading relationship with the leaders of the African kingdoms. The kingdoms would fight other kingdoms for each other's slaves. Especially with the increase in Europeans' demands for slavery, it put more pressure on the African leaders, which caused them to wage even more wars, and since the Europeans provided the guns in exchange for slaves, the kingdoms had a vast amount of victims in the crossfires. Once the slave trade began having a negative impact on their kingdoms, they used the weapons to rebel against the Europeans, which led to a decrease in their population. Another effect the Atlantic slave trade had on the Africans was a traumatic experience, meaning that the Africans were never going to forget the event. They were separated from their families, they lost loved ones, they were abused and dehumanized. The Atlantic slave trade became a traumatic memory to the Africans, and they were unwilling to trust the whites. They were in constant fear of being taken and treated like animals again. Thus, all of this meant that Africa was vulnerable to outside forces, especially that of the Europeans, who would come later and conquer Africa, known as the Scramble for Africa.